about? Okay, we're on the air officially now. Talking about Paul's letter to the Roman church. And I think we're just about into chapter 11. I think we started that last week. So we have a question that begins that chapter. I asked them, did God reject his people? By no means. Why is that question being asked?
I think it's a rhetorical question.
Okay.
I think based on what the predicate that he's laid, he's saying, did God reject you or did you reject?
Okay. Yeah, did God reject his people? It's, again, a letter that is dealing with a church of people from different backgrounds. Some are Jewish people, some are Gentile people, and they're having difficulty getting along. And that's one of the issues here. The Jewish people have kind of felt like they're God's people. And now there's a lot of Gentiles in the church, and there's some discomfort there. And the question, as Patrick was alluding to in his sermon this morning, the Jews have felt kind of special. Let's say they felt they were better than everybody else because God had favored them with a law and a history and some great heroes and heroines. And now their special place is threatened as the church and the message of Jesus is available to everyone. And so this question comes up. Has God made a mistake? He couldn't deal with Israel, and so he's opened it to everybody. What is going on there? And so I think that's what he's getting at here. And Paul says, no, not all of the Jews have been rejected. I'm a Jew. I'm a faithful descendant of Abraham from the tribe of Benjamin. God did not reject his people whom he foreknew. This is all part of God's plan. It's not something where God had to make a change in the middle of the stream, if you will, and do something different. God has always been concerned about everyone. Don't you know what the scripture says in the passage about Elijah, how he appealed to God against Israel? They killed your prophets, how he appealed to God. And we talked about that briefly last time. Elijah felt all alone. But God said, no, you're not alone, Elijah. There's still 7,000 people that have not fallen away. And we talked briefly about that, how sometimes we can feel all alone. Everybody else is fallen away. We're the only ones who really, and it's kind of a feeling that sometimes besets us. And we need to have faith in God that there are people who are faithful to God. And so I think he's getting at that a little bit here. Why does he bring that up in this context of this letter? In a sense, we tend to view people as groups. And there's a little of that in what Elijah was saying, more than a little bit. Everybody's fallen away. We tend to do that. We say they believe this, we categorize people in groups. And sometimes we're all, as if everybody in a group is all alike. And I think one of the reminders of this passage is that God deals with people as individuals. He doesn't judge people as a group. He doesn't reject all of the Israelites because a lot of them have rejected him. There are those who are faithful, and God sees those people and blesses them and deals with them, as he did in the case of Elijah. And so it's easy in our own time, perhaps we're not judging the Jews and the Gentiles as much as categorizing other groups. Well, that group, that nationality, that race, that group, they're not interested in Jesus, or we make other judgments on the basis of groups, whereas God looks at people, and we need to do that too, don't we? Look at people. And Elijah was also, he's kind of judging other people's faith and saying, well, they're all, Jezebel was after him, so they've all, they're all against God. I'm the only one who's faithful. And sometimes we're like that too. We judge other people's faith. And we say, well, that person, they don't do it exactly as I do, so they're not really interested in God. And so that's one of the consequences, and one of the underlying messages perhaps here. Paul goes on and says, so too at the present time there is a remnant chosen by grace. And if by grace, then it is no longer by works. If it were, grace would no longer be grace. We need to give the glory to God. We don't earn salvation, thank goodness, because, again, we're like Patrick said, we're always judging. Well, I've worked 11 hours out of the day, or since early in the morning. Somebody else came in at the 11th. We tend to judge and compare ourselves with other people rather than looking at the grace of God and God's mercy and tender love. And so it's easy to do that, isn't it? There's all that group of people. They're the latecomers. However you want to, I've been around for however many years, but God loves everyone. So anyway, that's what kind of came to mind as I thought about this passage concerning Elijah. It goes on the next paragraph. What Israel sought so earnestly, it did not obtain, but the elect did. What did Israel seek? They sought a Messiah. That was, somebody was going to come back. But I think we mentioned last time, they sought a Messiah that would raise up the nation again, and they would become a politically powerful nation, independent nation, get rid of the Romans, and go on and conquer perhaps other people. But the elect, they did not obtain that type of Messiah, but the elect did, because what? They sought through faith in God, And so they got what they sought in faith: forgiveness, relationship with God through the mediator, Jesus Christ. Okay, the others were hardened. This is kind of some tough passage. It is written, God gave them a spirit of stupor, eyes so that they could not see, and ears so that they could not hear. To this very day, the Jewish people as a group of people have not accepted the Messiah. Some have, Paul says, some have who had an inkling of this faith, but God gave them a spirit of stupor. How does he do that? This comes from a couple places in the Old Testament. One, even before they entered into the promised land from Deuteronomy. I'll read just a few verses here from Deuteronomy chapter 29, starting at verse 2. This is Moses in his kind of testamentary messages. He's kind of given his last words to the Israelites. Your eyes have seen all that the Lord did in Egypt to Pharaoh, to all his officials, and to all his land. We talked about that earlier. Pharaoh was hardened. With your own eyes, you saw those great trials, those miraculous signs, great wonders. But to this day, the Lord has not given you a mind that understands, or eyes that see, or ears that hear. During the 40 years that I led you through the desert, your clothes did not wear out, nor did the sandals on your feet. You ate no bread and drank no wine or other fermented drink. I did this so that you might know that I am the Lord your God. And what was the result? There's a lot of murmuring. There's a lot of, they worship the golden calf. Throughout the 40 years of wandering, there's been promises. They couldn't hang on to that faith in what God had accomplished to bring them across the Red Sea and out of Egypt. Couldn't handle it. Oh, I don't know why that was. We like to say, boy, those Israelites, if I'd have been there, I would have been different. I wonder. Because we in our own time sometimes have difficulty keeping a hold of God's mercy and his blessings in our lives. We take the time, sometimes when we look back and see what God has done for us over the years, how he's brought us to know Jesus Christ, and yet when we're challenged, we worry and fret. We say the wrong things. We don't treat people like we want to treat people. Anyway, God gave him a spirit of stupor, eyes that could not see, couldn't remember what they had been through. And you think that's what he's getting at here? Isaiah chapter 29 is another source for that thought. Paul is bringing up thoughts that appear in more than one place in the Old Testament. Isaiah chapter 29, verse 10. Woe, the first part of Isaiah deals a lot with woes and condemnation. The Lord, start verse 9, Isaiah 29, starting verse 9. Be stunned and amazed, blind yourselves and be sightless. Be drunk, but not from wine. Stagger, but not from beer. This version said, the Lord has brought over you a deep sleep. He has sealed your eyes. The prophets he has covered. See, he has sealed your eyes, parentheses, the prophets. He has covered your heads, the seers. What's he saying? It's a kind of an odd way to use the parenthetical in this translation. But the prophets and the seers were the ones by which the Lord sought to bring his people back. And due to their lack of understanding and lack of faith, they persecuted the prophets And so the Lord doesn't give them any. Anyway, so David says back in Romans chapter 11, may their table become a snare and a trap, a stumbling block and a retribution for them. May their eyes be darkened so they cannot see, and their backs be bent forever. Again from Psalms. Israel is, he's talking about the nation of Israel as the situation existed at that time. Why, as a group, the majority of Israelites have rejected God, have rejected God's plan through Jesus. So it's a tough situation. Well, maybe we'll read a little further and then kind of ask, what in the world does this have to do with our situation, if anything, or is it just a historical study? Again, I ask, did they stumble so as to fall beyond recovery? Not at all. Rather, because of their transgression, salvation has come to the Gentiles to make Israel envious. But if their transgression means riches for the world, and their loss means riches for the Gentiles, how much greater riches will their fullness bring? Kind of an interesting view of the history there. What I think Paul, as somebody mentioned last time, when he'd go into a town and a missionary, he'd start with the Jewish people. Often he'd get thrown out or beat up, and then he'd go and start preaching in the open agora, or start turning to the Gentiles. And so that's what type of thing he's saying here is, if the situation as it transpires, Christianity is able to be viewed not as just a sect of the Jews, as an offshoot of Judaism, but it is a message of God to all people. And so things have worked out that way. But he's saying, if the Jews can come back, that's what he's saying. It's interesting, we read about, and one commentator says, Paul was a missionary to the Gentiles, and that's what he was called to be. But these other guys, they were preaching the gospel here and there, evidently, but they didn't, as far as we see, they didn't show, I'm talking about the other apostles, they didn't show great inclination to preach to the Gentiles. They're happy to preach to the Jews. We don't know for sure what all their life histories was. But anyway, things have worked out, and God has seen this and used it and so on. I'm talking to you Gentiles, and as much as I'm the apostle to the Gentiles, I make much of my ministry in the hope that I may somehow arouse my own people to envy and save some of them. He never forgets Israel. In a sense, we're like that too. Our family is the church, but we never forget, children, relatives, those who are close to us. We never forget them. We'd love for them to be part of God's blessings. And anyway, rouse them to envy. A strange way to put it, but maybe it happens that somebody will see that the Gentiles have been touched by the Lord and want that. For if their rejection is the reconciliation of the world, what will their acceptance be but life from the dead? If the part of the dough offered as first fruits is holy, then the whole batch is holy. If the root is holy, so are the branches. Kind of an odd way to put it. He's referring back to the Old Testament, where the Jewish people raised crops, and they wanted that effort to be successful. Get a lot of good crops, and they wouldn't rot and all this. So how did they deal with that? They offered the first fruits of the crop to God. That's what was under the law. And that, in a sense, blessed the entire crop. And that's what he's saying, the Jews, in a sense. If the root is holy, so are the branches. If some of the branches have been broken off through unbelief, and you, though a wild olive shoot, have been grafted in among the others, who's a wild olive shoot? Since we've been grafted in. And I thought about, well, that's really true, because we spend a lot of time when we come together here at the church building studying what? Jewish history. Those are not my ancestors in a physical sense. They're not your ancestors in a physical sense, as far as I know. But we spend a lot of time, because in a sense, those are spiritual ancestors, at least. Those studies lead us to know God better. So that's why we spend a lot of time studying ancient history here. Anyway, it's interesting to some of us others who say, oh, I'm not really your historian. They've been grafted in. Do not boast over those branches. If you do, consider this: you do not support the root, but the root supports you. You will say that branches were broken off so that I could be grafted in. It must be better than those branches. Granted, but they were broken off because of unbelief. And you stand by faith. Do not be arrogant, but be afraid. For if God did not spare the natural branches, he will not spare you either if there's a lack of faith. That's the key. We can, almost all of these verses can be interpreted by the message of Romans salvation by faith. Any comments or?
I was,
Yeah.
when I read this, growing up on a farm and being involved in growing things.
In what, I'm sorry?
Being involved in growing things, I easily relate to something like this. It seems that it's the back and forth just constantly of one group reaching some height and resenting the Jews, resenting the word is given to the Gentiles.
Yeah.
And the Gentiles are, especially the ones like the centurion that Peter dealt with, that they have been a religious person in their family for a long time. They are probably very happy to be brought in, but I'm sure there were others that thought, well, this is great, we'll just join the bunch and so you have this great big pot of people, or maybe a small pot, maybe just like our congregation.
Yeah.
Because we have people who are at all different levels of learning and faith. And it can cause all sorts of tensions and problems within.
Okay, I'm not sure.
You're not sure. Well, I think when I'm talking about the branches, they're being told that the tree comes out and the branches broken off, and they put a a sampler in
Yeah,
of, like, from a plant and it grows.
yeah,
And that's the Gentiles coming in.
yes,
But don't be arrogant about that.
Right.
Because that can be snapped off.
that's right. And it's so easy to regraft
That's
in
right.
the original branches that take out.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's all, sometimes we think, well, we're the main tree, if you will. We like to look at ourselves, if you will, as the main tree. And we're the ones that reach out to others but God can work it in different ways. I've mentioned before, I went to a seminar on prayer one time in a home, and it was led by a man from Nigeria. And we got to talk, and what are you doing here? And so he says, I'm a missionary to America from the church in Nigeria. I'm a missionary to America. We usually think of America as sending out missionaries, but God works in different ways. And so I appreciate I still have material from that seminar and use it from time to time, but it kind of reorients your thinking.
What did he that we needed besides, obvious stuff that we know? What did he see? What did they see? Why did they send him?
Just his focus was on prayer,
Oh,
and that we needed to spend a lot more time in prayer. And it was a whole series of
I
a
see.
booklet on how to pray more effectively.
Okay, I can see that.
Anyway, and maybe that's so. We say, well, it's a post-Christian age, and we face difficulties. God can bring about a restoration. Maybe it doesn't come from America. Maybe it comes from India. Maybe it comes from Nigeria. Who knows? We get the newsletter from some workers in India here at the church office, and they say, there's more members of the church in India than in the United States. And wait a minute, kind of reorients your thinking there. They're in a minority and sometimes face persecution, but there's a lot of them there that we're not aware of. Anyway, I think that's what Paul would say. There's a lot of people, and its connection with Elijah, there's a lot of people that are faithful to the Lord that maybe we're not aware of. Anyway, do not be arrogant. Consider the kindness and sternness of God, sternness to those who fell. This is verse 22. But kindness to you, provided that you continue in his kindness. Otherwise, you also will be cut off. And if they do not persist in unbelief, they will be grafted in, for God is able to graft them in again. After all, if you were cut out of an olive tree that is wild by nature, and contrary to nature, were grafted into a cultivated olive tree, how much more readily will the natural branches be grafted into their own olive tree? That is kind of what we've been saying. God can accept it. And I do not want you to be ignorant of this mystery, brothers, so that you may not be conceited. That's the purpose of this. Don't be puffed. Well, God got rid of the Jews, and now I'm the best race. Israel has experienced a hardening in part until the full number of the Gentiles has come in. And so all Israel will be saved. As it is written, the deliverer will come from Zion, turn godlessness away from Jacob. And that's been the verse that has been the subject of a lot of writing and discussion over the centuries. When is it going to come? Is there going to come a time when a lot of people of Jewish descent will come back and will come to Christ. We see some, it used to be when I was working downtown, you'd see on the corner these guys handing out brochures called Jews for Jesus. If you've been around, maybe you've seen them too. I don't know if they're not around other cities, but we have a lot of Jewish people here. And that was always interesting. Is there going to be a big resurgence? A lot of people, well, there's no sign in the year 2021 of a big number of Jewish people coming to Jesus. There's some. So this has got to be coming in the millennium or in the, some future age. I don't know. I think my view of it is the emphasis should be on the word soul. And so all Israel will be saved. What does the soul encompass? How? The same as everybody else, by faith. So shall all Israel be saved. Some people have said that when he says, so all Israel shall be saved, that he's now talking about spiritual Israel, the spiritual descendants of Abraham by faith. It's not the physical descent, but the spiritual descent. So different views are taken of this verse. And there's a lot of discussion and in the religious thinking of Jews and Gentiles. And there's a lot of what is the meaning of the nation of Israel and what is the meaning of conflict over there. I think that in this world, the Lord, in our time, the Lord just views people as people. And that distinction of the Jews and the Gentiles is, I think, is overemphasized. Anyway, that's just my kind of view of that controversial verse. That it gets back to what, and some commentators have pointed it out, is a reference here to Jeremiah chapter 31. What's in Jeremiah chapter 31 of all things? But it's the new covenant. There's a new covenant now. It's not based upon the law of Moses. That's long gone. Anyway, this is the covenant I will make with the house of Israel. After that time, declares the Lord, I will put my law in their minds and write it on their hearts. I will be their God, and they will be my people. No longer will a man teach his neighbor or a man his brother, saying, know the Lord, because they will all know me, from the least of them to the greatest, declares the Lord. For I will forgive their wickedness and will remember their sins no more. I think we're living in the time of the new covenant based on faith. And I think that's what Paul overall is getting at here. Under the Jewish law, if you were born, you had to be taught. You're a Jewish person. And so now, if you've come to Christ, you already have been taught about the law of God. They will all know me from the least of them to the greatest. Anyway. Study that. The deliverer will come from Zion. He will turn godlessness away from Jacob. This is my covenant with them when I take away their sins. That's the bottom line, isn't it? As far as the gospel is concerned, they are enemies on your account. But as far as election is concerned, they are loved on account of the patriarchs. For God's gifts and his call are irrevocable. Just as you were at one time disobedient to God who were at one time disobedient to God have now received mercy as a result of their disobedience. Kind of hard, it kind of accelerated the preaching of the gospel to the whole world. The fact that things happened to the Israelites. We think of early on, how did the gospel get preached? Well, there was a persecution in Jerusalem, and all these people spread out. Well, that got the gospel preached to a lot of Jewish congregations. And as a result of things that happened there, the gospel got spread to other nations and other peoples. Anyway, be interesting to, we read the kind of the outline in the book of Acts. Be interesting if we get the situation, we could ask God, what was your underlying plan? How did you work all these things together to get the gospel to Rome? We don't, we got a letter to Rome. We don't know exactly how the church there was founded. How did you get the church in all of these places? We read of some of them, but there's a lot we don't read. Anyway, they now become disobedient. For God has bound all men over to disobedience so that he may have mercy on them all. That's what we need to appreciate, and that's what binds us together, the mercy of God. That's what we really have in common, is that we all need the mercy of God. And so that suggests that we should be merciful in dealing with one another. We've mentioned that before, we talk about justice, but what we really need is mercy. The last few verses of this Romans chapter 11 is kind of like a hymn or a prayer. And if you're ever looking for a good way to kind of organize a prayer, here's a good place. Oh, the depth of the riches of wisdom and knowledge of God, how unsearchable his judgments and his paths beyond tracing out. Who has known the mind of the Lord, or has seen his counselor? Who has ever given to God that God should repay him? For from him and through him and to him are all things. To him be the glory forever. Amen. So that's I used to do the kind of start a prayer based upon a verse that I picked up in Psalms, or there's good. This is kind of one from the New Testament. There's one in Jude. It always comes to my mind in praying to God. Pick up some thoughts from some of these meaningful verses. In this version, it's outlined as poetry as opposed to the preceding prose. Anyway, any comments on that chapter? We have come to a point of transition in the book. How do we know? Because the next verse reads, therefore, is a word of segue or transition. Therefore, given all the stuff that's come before in the first 11 chapters of Romans, therefore, and Romans 12 begins what some people say, well, this is the rest is kind of theoretical. It's hard to make that distinction, but now he starts the practical aspect of what he's been teaching. Most of Paul's letters are organized that way. You come to a therefore. What does all of this mean? What does it mean that you have salvation by faith? What does it mean in your day-to-day life that you have the unsearchable blessings of God. So that's what he's going to get into in the 12th chapter and beyond. We've got a few minutes, we'll just start. Therefore, I urge you, brothers, in view of God's mercy, which he's just emphasized in the 11th chapter, the mercy and forgiveness of God offered to all people, to offer your bodies as living sacrifices. That's familiar to the Jewish people. They offered sacrifices to God. And so, uses the image of the sacrifice. What comes to your mind when you think of that? What comes to my mind is Abraham offering Isaac, builds an altar. He puts some wood on there, and then he puts his son on there. Wow, the Israelites offered, cows and sheep and other things. They offered grain and that stuff. But he's talking here about a living sacrifice. I always think of Isaac, and pleasing to God. This is your spiritual act of worship. Your spiritual act of worship. That's how you worship God. What you do with your body, your life, if you will. And that gets me into the one of my hobbies, to use an old term. When we think of worship, what do we think about? So often we think of worship service. The worship service, it takes place at 9:30 on a Sunday morning. And it's a great thing. The Bible, I don't know, do we ever find the term worship service? We talk about worship. This is the verse that comes to my mind. Offer your body a living sacrifice. We worship God when we come together through song. We sing the praises of worship of God. We worship God in the sense of coming to him in prayer and showing respect that he's the one that controls what happens and he's the giver of gifts. I guess, we worship God when we drop our money in the box. We don't have passive trays anymore. We got a box with a slot up there. We worship God that way. We worship in the sense the Lord's Supper is something that we do out of respect to Jesus. And we hear a sermon, that takes about half the time. Is that a worship? It can lead us to reflect on our lives and think worshipful thoughts.
But worship by just how we live every day, thinking about God and our relationship to him and how we want to conform to what he's like in different situations and whatever we do, to be like him, be holy like him. So that's a worship, I think, on a daily basis.
I've said it before, to me, the worship service is more like the pep rally. I mentioned it before when I was in high school. Before the big football game, they'd have a pep rally. They'd get everybody together. Oh, you'd sing songs. You'd sing the school song. Everybody get worked up and excited. The guys up there would give speeches, the principal and the football coach. And everybody get excited for the big game. And the pep rally was good. I went to all of them because you didn't have to go to class if you went to the pep rally. But it's not the game.
Right.
It's not the game. You can feel great, but you haven't won the game as a result of attending the pep rally. You're preparing to support the team, and the real thing is the game. As I've been thinking about it more, the metaphor, if you will, I've thought of, what we call the worship service or the meetings that we have. I'm more of a baseball fan than a football fan, really. And in baseball, you don't have the same kind of pep rally that you do in football, but you have a team meeting. You know, they have a team meeting before they start a series. What do? They get together, everybody's supposed to be there because they're gonna plan what they're gonna do. How are you gonna play this other opponent when he comes to bat? Where are you gonna position yourself? How are you gonna pitch to him? And in a sense, that's what we do when we come together in our meetings. We plan, how are we gonna deal when the game starts and when, Satan does this to us? How are we gonna react to that? How are we gonna react when he hits us with sickness? How are we gonna react when there's temptation? And so in a sense, it's a kind of a team meeting, preparing for the real action, which occurs in a baseball over a period of, sometimes 3 or 4 days. Sometimes it's a 7-game series. But anyway, that's just some of my reflections on worship service. I guess it's a good term. But we'll talk a little bit more about that next time. What do you think of the idea? I think the danger in saying worship service is we say, well, I worship God from 9:30 to 10:30 on Sunday morning. I worship God. Now I'm going to go out and take care of the rest of or take care of life, if you will. It leads us to kind of compartmentalize the worship, whereas this verse in Romans suggests that the worship is what we do, 24 hours a day, if you will, or when you're not sleeping or whatever. Anyway, that's just maybe another term would be better. I don't know. What do you think? Think about it. Let me know next week. Okay.
That homework, oh man.
Yeah, homework.
Homework.
No.
Chapter 12 gets into other aspects of the response to salvation by faith. Okay, thanks again for attention and thought.